and Bahari. Very well. Listen, as people are coming in, the participants are coming in. Good afternoon. My name is Andre Marcu. I'm the executive director of ERCSD, which is a complicated name, the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition. If you are in the right place, you are in the International Town Hall on CBAM from concepts to action and regulation in trade partner countries. So very much, I will give a few details as we go along, but what I would like to wait for a few more people to stream in. Most of the panel, with the exception of one panelist, is here. Maybe Sarah, you reach out to our Indian colleagues to make sure that they are joining in time, and Mike Melling will join. So again, welcome. This is the one of the activities that ERCSD has been carrying out for the last, what is it, around 4 years now. When the idea of CBAM was introduced, I think whether we're proud or not, but we have hopefully contributed, being one of the first ones out of the blocks in discussing the concept, the various options, the KPIs associated with each option, etc., and then accompany the development of the CBAM through this proposal and then the trilogue developments. We've held a number of international town halls. It was our little contribution to international cooperation and understanding of the policy that was being developed. Now we are now in a different stage, and that different stage is the fact that we have a directive, and then we have a CBAM that has entered into transitional phase starting in October 1st, 2023, with reporting coming out very shortly in the new year. Now, all is good. One thing that needs to be reminded, though, that there is legislation and there is regulation. And what the legislation has come into force, and it's on the books. Regulation in the force of implementing acts, which are the many of, is still streaming in. And some of it is more technical, some of them has more political implications, but this is continuing to happen. We have, Aaron and Michael and myself have, through a number of other activities, reached out to different countries. We were recently, and Bahar would know, we were in Turkey. Mr. Rashmi will know, we're in India a couple of weeks ago. I think, Aaron, I'm losing track of time. But at that time, and Michael has joined us. But one thing that we heard is that while we wanted to talk about a number of things and how other options existed and how others, how could things be maybe looked in different ways, the question came back all the time about CBAM, because this is real, it's here, it's not hypothetical, it's not a discussion the way the CBAM was 2 years ago, it's a real thing. So people are asking very detailed discussion. So now with the rubber hits the road, we are not in the concept, we are into action and regulation. And we have trade partner countries, so there are real exporters, real importers, real regulators in the EU, real regulators in the exporting countries. These are things that are really taking place, and people need to know and have very concrete questions and concrete answers. So this is where we are. The intention is not to go through what the Commission is doing, and the Commission is doing, I'm not one to be a sycophant of the Commission or to congratulate them necessarily, but I think they've done a very good job in putting together a lot of information material and reaching out. They will continue to do so, and it never is enough, and there's no perfection in anything, but I think they've made a real effort. So it's not the intention to duplicate that. The intention is to provide a forum for some of the questions to emerge and understanding maybe some of the answers. I will pass it on very quickly to my friends Aaron Cosby and Michael Melling. We are a team, and well, what I always say, you should be a fly on the wall listening to our internal debates. because while we're friends, we're also very hard debaters and very hard. We hold on to our ideas very dearly. So what you see from us sometimes is the result also of compromises. Aaron, you go first, please.
Sure, we'll give Michael a chance to relax after having passed through security. Thanks, Andre. I think the key headstone for this, or the capstone for this meeting, is the fact that CBAM has, as you said, now entered into force. We're in a period of transition, the transition phase, which is a period for the Commission of learning about how the CBAM works, and also of collecting data to try to understand how some of the harder rules should be cast in stone as of the definitive period, which begins in a couple of years. So the questions that I'm going to go over, for me, some of the questions that should be very closely monitored by international partners of the EU, trading partners of the EU, some of the more important points that have yet to be decided, either because they are technically difficult and have been pushed down the road until the EU can learn more about the specifics of how they will roll out, or because they are politically difficult and the Commission has kicked them down the road. But in any case, they will be material for partner countries. So just four of my favorite topics that fit within the subject area of this town hall, in no particular order of relevance. First, because it is, I think, most relevant, use of revenues, the revenues from the CBAM. I think, let me start off by saying, I think the CBAM is a fair instrument. It does level the playing field. It does its best not to discriminate against foreign producers, according them equal treatment to EU producers in most cases. And it's actually an enabling mechanism for a carbon price to be felt by European consumers and European producers. But of course, it also has material impacts for foreign exporters, who will have to comply with onerous requirements for information and set up systems of accounting that they don't already have. And it will mean for some loss of market access if they are more GHG intense. Often those exporters will be those in countries that have the least to do with the climate crisis and the fewest means to address the crisis. And so if we care about global development, and if we care about global climate change mitigation as to just mitigation within the EU, and if you don't succeed at both of those objectives, nothing else works, then the CBAM is incomplete. It needs an aid facility. It is incomplete and unfair. If we are going to impose those costs, even if it's a mechanism that's totally fair and non-discriminatory, if the EU is going to impose those kinds of costs on foreign exporters, it needs to help those in greatest need by having some sort of a facility that recycles the revenue of the CBAM to help governments and firms comply with not only comply with the obligations of the CBAM, but in fact decarbonize in order to avoid the worst of the charges that the CBAM imposes. Second issue, crediting. We don't yet know how crediting for foreign carbon price will work. And we at ERCST have done some work on this, produced a very interesting paper that we didn't think was going to be an interesting paper, but there are a lot of issues here which rise to the fore when you start to dig deeper into it. This is one of the questions that will be settled eventually in implementing legislation. We will see some sort of a framework for how the EU credits a foreign carbon price. Seems straightforward enough. But there are some lingering questions that foreign countries should be paying attention to and lobbying the EU in behalf of their own interests. Will the EU, for example, accept offset credits that are bought under a domestic compliance regime elsewhere, which in the country of export do count toward the obligations of those firms that are buying the credits, and count to lower the GHG intensity of that production? Will the EU accept those as a carbon price effectively paid? Will tradable performance requirements, such as they have in Australia, be counted as a carbon price? Will taxes on exports only be counted as an effective carbon price? These are a number of decisions that will have material impact on exporters in other countries and have yet to be decided, and on which other countries should be taking a keen interest in the machinations and decisions of the Commission. Third, Scope 2. We know that when the definitive period comes, there is probably going to be a move to cover more Scope 2 emissions. Currently, it's only the case for cement and fertilizers, but the stated intent is to increase that coverage to goods like, for example, for aluminum, and for aluminum, Scope 2 is everything. Aluminum is solid electricity, basically. But the reason it's not in there in the first place is because aluminum producers at present are afraid of resource shuffling, afraid of the fact that any firm can claim green electricity inputs as a result of purchases from the grid without actually changing their productive process and without actually changing anything about the grid. Resource shuffling is an issue for sectors like cement, or for like aluminum. Currently, it's dealt with by not referring to specific facility-specific Scope 2 emissions, but using the national average of grid intensity to calculate Scope 2 emissions. But there are valuable individual exceptions that firms can access to have their own, for example, their own captive power generation is counted as Scope 2. It may be that including further Scope 2 emissions and more products under Scope 2 emissions, the Commission will seek to narrow those valuable exceptions for individual facilities. That's something that should be carefully watched. And finally, exports. Exports are one of the biggest questions that the Commission wrestled with throughout the period of trying to decide what the CBAM would look like. They were urged by many, including every producer association under the covered goods, to include some form of export rebate for exports. Some of these producers, some of these sectors export more than 20% of their production. And under the current proposed system, those exports will go out into the world labored with a carbon price that will make them uncompetitive in third country markets. But out of respect for WTO rules, among other things, the Commission has not proposed any sort of export rebate. They will still be under intense pressure to do so in the definitive period, and in fact, we'll have to think about, as a result of the trade data they get in the transition period, we'll have to think about what they do to solve the export problem. And this is a hot topic to watch, and something, again, that foreign governments, foreign producers should be carefully monitoring. As I said, in no particular order, my favorite subjects. I'll pass it over to you, Michael.
Mike?
All right. Yeah, thanks. Hi from Munich Airport. So it was a little bit tight with security. So I won't add much to what Aaron said with the substantive topics. I think, we have a great lineup of panelists, and I'm eager to hear your views. But I'll echo what Andres said about these international town halls, and that ERCC started sort of thinking about the international dimension of the CBAM probably earlier than the institutions were able to, because this is a very contested or controversial file in the domestic European politics and the compromises that underlie European climate policy. And so those that were drafting the CBAM, preparing the CBAM, they had a lot of work internally, focusing internally on ironing out the various interests and getting everybody on board with the CBAM, and didn't have probably enough time to sort of look beyond the European borders until now, what's being implemented. So there's a catching up that has to occur. And of course, as Andre mentioned, the Commission has come out with tremendously valuable capacity building training materials to understand sort of the how of compliance. But there will still be questions about the why, for instance, and questions about gaps that are not fully addressed in the capacity building materials that have been made available so far. And if we've learned one thing over the last 4 years working on the CBAM, it is that it's a topic that also continues to evolve. It's never in a static, position. It keeps being challenged by new developments, political, but also technological. And just last month, we had discussions about, as you know, the global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum that could have potentially very fundamentally altered how the CBAM operates on those two commodities and who it affects. Now, that has been kind of punted down the road, but any cooperation with other countries, whether it is countries that are going to impose some kind of border carbon adjustment or with countries that are affected by them, has the potential of, again, kind of affecting and changing this complex package of measures and processes and procedures, etc. So therefore, we really feel it's still important and continues to be really relevant to have these international town halls to engage with the many countries around the world and the stakeholders there that are affected by the CBAM. And we look forward to the inputs and discussion that we'll hear today in this session.
Very well. Look, I will not. Aaron has made a wonderful list, and I don't think it's wise to go for me to go through it again. But nevertheless, we all have our favorites on that list. What we want to hear is what are your favorites, what are the questions and what are the issues that are emerging. So we have divided this discussion today into two parts. The first part is CBAM from concept to action. We're trying to, in the first session, which is Niels Pohl from the European Association of Automotive Suppliers, CLEPA, Paolo Falconi from APLIA, Eva Cartwright from European Association for Forwarding, Transport, Logistics and Customs Services, CLECAT. Who is missing here, as I said to some of you, is Vicente Hurtado Roa, who has called me a couple of hours before begging a family emergency. And again, I think it's something that we all have to respect, because these things happen. Vicente has been with us many, many times, and of course we will miss his very real experience today. But so this is the first part. Now, what we're looking for ideally, what we were looking for in this discussion is, this is operational, and people are getting questions. How do I do this? How do I do that? What do I have to do? Where do I have to do it? Am I covered? Am I not covered? Question about crediting, question about a lot of things, that maybe some of the things that Aaron have mentioned, and some of them haven't sold yet. But nevertheless, I think not everybody is deeply into this. People actually make things. Not everybody is involved into policy discussions. Some people do make things, and those people are preoccupied as to make things, as to find clients and make money. This is a policy issue that they are learning that they have an additional obligation, and it's a surprise to many of them, but a surprise is real. So I will start with Niels. So Niels, from your side, from the automotive suppliers side, as importers, what do you see? What do you hear from your members? What do you see people calling you and your phone ringing off the hook, maybe?
Yes, indeed. I would say it's true that we receive many phone calls and emails. I mean, we've been following the CBAM discussion at least for 3 years, but it was a quite select group which was interested in it. But recently the group has become much bigger now. So just to take one step back, in general, CLEPA has always believed that carbon pricing in itself is a good measure, because it's technology open, so you would allow the market then to find the right solutions. Of course, the concern that we have very much, and therefore I think it's very good that we have an international town hall, is that this is a measure that needs to be implemented in a global context, where also global partners, where we need them. And I think initially, and then to make it concrete as well to the operational, the block is initially this was very much on maybe also a fear of retaliation, of the fact that this would be misunderstood as a protectionist measure. But recently we've also seen that also from another element, this global outreach is very important, because in the end, so automotive suppliers, when they source aluminium or steel, which is mostly what is currently in the scope for us, then mostly we would do this in the European Union. No, typically you source externally if you need certain qualities that are not sufficiently available on the European market. Sometimes it may also not be that there is maybe some offer, but it's not competitive. No, but there is quite a big dependency in those cases where you source externally. Also, you have a certification procedure, so you cannot just switch one supplier for another very easily. So even though the principle of a carbon price and the beauty of the market is of course there, but still, given you have long-term agreements on, for instance, a vehicle type, on the kind of products that you use, in reality, you don't have as much flexibility in the sourcing as you may expect. And then what the companies now, of course, see is that they already have to start gathering the data now, and that initially they thought, okay, we can maybe use default values, and that is then not necessarily very attractive, because then the commission or the customs authority would assume the highest carbon footprint for that product, so you pay more, but at least you have a basis to work with, and we have an interest to work with our suppliers to actually then try to get the real data so that the price levy changes and that their products also become more competitive. So then there is a win-win and a reason to cooperate. And because we now have the reporting period, which in itself makes a lot of sense, of course, to first gather information, there is now the problem that you actually need to start explaining to a lot of suppliers, and often these are not necessarily directly the manufacturers, that you need to have all kinds of data, that you need to fill out an extensive Excel file, that you need to have data that also is partly confidential, because if you see the CO2 in the different steps of the production, you get quite a close picture of what is needed. And that often with suppliers who may be based in countries that are actually highly suspect of this CBAM. No, so this whole part of the engagement is very tricky. And then I don't leave aside all the issues on the company side. Where do you organize it? Which department do you make in charge? Is this the customs? Is this a sustainability department? There is not yet a platform available. So I think there are lots of questions, and of course also in the industry initiatives to try to get these systems up and running. But now they need to get much faster than they typically were, because there are all kinds of reasons why this is complex. Because as I made earlier, the point of this confidentiality, typically there is in the automotive industry, and I think in many industries, you don't necessarily want your customer to know exactly who your suppliers are, where do you source, because that of course makes then negotiations also more tricky and could bring you in a difficult situation, especially if your customer is much bigger than you are. So there are all kinds of reasons why data sharing in general is always a topic that takes a lot of time. And these are this is a little bit the context in which companies need to start making these reports, and which lead of course to all kinds of questions.
Thanks, Niels. Paulo, your members are also in the business of trading and reporting, quite a few parts, I guess. So how's that value chain coming in, and what kind of issues do you see in your industry?
Good afternoon. Actually, I agree with the key points that Klepa just made about CBAM being a hint to the rest of the geographies of the world that either we do the same, or there will be one geography which will be penalized, which is Europe in this sense. And what members feel, it is what I would like to share with you by a way of an example. I'm sure that you have seen and you have worked with the extensive Excel spreadsheet where you have to fill in everything about all the steel. Let's make the example of the steel that you purchase. But that comes very close to a nightmare for a purchasing department of any company. Imagine that you are the purchasing department of a multinational company manufacturing home appliances in Europe, in this case. Imagine that you have to purchase materials for a couple of millions washing machine, a couple of millions dishwashers, a couple of millions of fridges, which is the yearly output of that factory. Let's consider back of the envelope 20 kilograms of steel per appliances, 6 million appliances. You need 120,000 tons of steel. Give or take 700 euro per ton, it's 85 million euro that you have to spend. You know your market because you are the group director, so you know which are the major steel manufacturing in the world. You want to speak with the top ones. So you have ArcelorMittal, you have China Bao Steel Group, you have Nippon Steel, you might have Tata Steel. All of them have a manufacturing capacity in terms of steel mills, which is spread all around the world. Apart from the Chinese one, all of them have steel mills in Europe, they have in the Americas, they have in Asia, in India, so everywhere. And what you do normally, as being the group purchasing director, you negotiate with them in terms of quality of steel, delivery terms, spot long-term prices, payment conditions, and it's not necessarily an easy discussion because the cost of steel largely is reflected in the cost of the final product. So the better you are in negotiating, the more convenient the product would be for the final customers. Then, at the end of September, a colleague that you not even knew the existence came to knock on your door and told, wait a second, now you have to ask for a couple of more things to your potential suppliers. So you have to ask where each flat rolled steel, they give you also the CN number 7208, that you purchase come from. Which steel mill does it come from? What kind of energy was used to produce that rolled steel? Where each of the precursors, which are many, iron ore, coal, coke, limestone, scrap steel comes from, how they have been delivered to the mill, and how actually the steel came to Europe. So you see that this is quite a step change in the way the negotiating is happening. And then, in other words, the price of steel that you purchase might even go up because of this extensive information requirement. Now, scale this negotiating efforts by the number of steel suppliers, by each company, and you understand that we are discussing about a massive administrative and financial burden. So all of a sudden, as a purchasing director, you realize that what you had learned at high school, it's eventually true. Your Latin teacher used to say in nomen omen, which roughly translates into in the name there is your destiny. And because in CBAM there is a BAM, you understand that this is a very little bomb that is placed between you and your suppliers. And why I'm closing with a consideration that is linked to what I started. Until this kind of solutions became worldwide, there will be one geography which determines your obligations. And in this case, for the downstream industries, which I'm representing and that I would add to the list that have been mentioned, and one of the open points, because it's still an open and a very big pain point, all downstream industries, until that is worldwide, there are geographies like Europe where already today CBAM has an impact. Even the transitional phase is not something that will go unnoticed. Because if you have to purchase steel and fill in a spreadsheet, which is probably 17 tabs, with information that you don't have, you will never be able to get, unless you factor that into the contractual negotiation, which means money. There will always be an incentive to go and manufacture outside where you do not have to fulfill all these obligations. So my point is, not only that this is going to be difficult, default values is not going to help because they will penalize everything and will not reflect the real CO2 content of products, but that there is an incentive already today for companies to simplify things, because companies have this mantra, time equal money. If I simplify, I save money and go somewhere else. This is something we must avoid. We must avoid at all costs, because that means deindustrialization of Europe. So it's not a very sober like landscape, the one that I'm depicting, but that is real. So we have to work with the Commission, which did a great job. I agree, that's definitely true, in order to make things as simple as possible and addressing all problems that have been listed, including coming to a CBAM 2.0 that would also take into account downstream products. Thank you.
Fascinating, Paula, but I could see my friend Aaron Cosby raising an eyebrow, so I think he probably was surprised by a few things and will have questions, as do I. But before we do that, let's go to Eva Cartwright from CLECAT. So Eva, what about your line of business, your members? What are the considerations? What do you hear? Because there are things that we're hearing here. Some of us being more pedestrian, not being in this business, we haven't thought of certain angles. So life is a learning process. Eva, please.
Well, good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for this opportunity. So I represent CLECAT, which is an association representing the interest of over 20 international freight forwarding and customs associations all around Europe. What I can tell you today is mostly a report from the trenches, if I can put it this way, because our members are the ones who are now implementing this regulation. Probably all of you are aware that for non-EU installations, the only way to report in the EU these CBAM obligations is through a so-called indirect representative. This means a type of customs representation where, according to the new regulation, the customs representative becomes totally liable for CBAM reporting. And I can tell you from the information we received from our members, there is very, very little appetite for becoming an indirect representative, because simply we haven't got the expertise. We are customs experts. We move 60 to 90% of the customs clear of the goods that arrive to Europe. But this regulation is something really, really new to us. CLECAT has been in touch with the Commission, and we are in constant conversation with them. We only just had a meeting yesterday, and we keep telling them that this is not something that customs agents can deal with. Our experience is that you were talking about big companies. You described how difficult it is for big companies. Our members typically represent those who do not have customs departments themselves, let alone departments who can deal with such depth of reporting. Typically, we're talking about SMEs. Typically, we're talking about those companies who cannot afford or simply want to outsource their customs activities. Our members are saying that there is very little information, even though the Commission has put out a lot, we agree with that, but there is still little awareness amongst companies, especially smaller ones without these departments, and they come to us as customs agent requiring information. And obviously, even though we give them as much as we can, we're not fully able to comply and to give them all the information. So that's one of the things that we're learning from our members, that there is very little awareness still with companies. There are impacts. The most important and the biggest issue is, again, I think I'm just repeating some of the people before me, the availability of information. As I mentioned before, even if a big company has a department dealing with carbon emissions, you can imagine that in a small company where there are only like 5-6 members of the company, there is very little availability and capability to access production data. There is also the e-commerce side of the CBAM regulation, which we feel that has not entirely been taken into account. We keep amongst ourselves, customs professionals, we keep mentioning the famous, now it became famous, the famous barbecue made out of iron that comes from the UK. Because even if it's above 150 euros, the value, then we need to report it. And express service providers, FedEx, DHL, are unable to comply with the CBAM regulation. Obviously, they simply do not have the data, neither does the private individual who is importing these goods. So these are everyday issues now since the 1st of October that we are facing, our members are facing, and there is still a huge amount of questions. I put down a really long list. I don't want to one important thing for EU-based for EU-based companies, the indirect representative has the right to refuse indirect representation. So that means that if somebody is representing a company as a customs agent, he or she can file a customs declaration, but say to the importer, sorry, I'm not prepared to do your CBAM declaration, you have to do it yourself. There is no safety net for these companies, let's put it this way. There is no, for these companies, the EU-based companies who have one customs representative who have already refused to do the CBAM, the only other option is to go and find another indirect representative. And as I mentioned, there is very little appetite because of the enormous amount of liability that is placed on the customs representatives. For non-EU based installations, I repeat, there is no other option. So this is causing a problem. There is no fallback plan what to do with these companies, and there is also, we do not know what to do with these goods. So what if the importer refuses? What if the famous barbecue importer says, okay, sorry, then I don't need this barbecue because I wasn't aware that this is subject to CBAM. What happened to that? Who will pay for the return of these goods? What will happen with the storage costs? So there are everyday examples now coming in. Almost every day there are like 5-6 emails from our members about these. So this is what I can report, as I say, as practical examples. We keep collecting these. We keep collecting questions about the execution, about the registry. There are issues with the registry. We are not sure how, for example, multiple those companies who have multiple locations within the EU, we're not sure how they can register, how can they report. We keep collecting as an association with these questions, and we are putting them to the Commission, and we have a promise that an FAQ will be published based on these. And we are putting enormous efforts about communicating and educating our members. But as a summary, I can say we are not having a great time these days. It is a huge amount of work still ahead of us.
Well, I think, thanks, Eva. I think the one thing that I'm going to have to reconsider in the case, Michael, buying golf clubs in Canada and importing them to the EU next at Christmas may not be a great idea. I never thought about this, but now all of a sudden Eva is telling me that I'm going to have to do a CBAM declaration for my golf clubs probably. The second thing is there's a business to be had here, maybe something that we should consider, because obviously there are people who are having trouble. But the one more serious thing that from Paolo's thing, if I understood correctly, and something I haven't thought about, maybe I misunderstood Paolo, but I would almost understand that when you choose your supplier now, you have all kind of numbers coming, the cost of the transportation, this, that, and the other thing. But there is another cost that you're not aware of, and maybe the cost of the CBAM.
Indeed.
And that exactly. All of a sudden, so you have to collect that information. At least you should collect that information before making a decision who you buy from.
That is exactly what is happening already today, that whenever a decision has to be made among which supplier to make, if there is a supplier that is supplying from outside of Europe, there is an extra cost. But then the extra complexity, and this is something that actually probably has not been taken into account sufficiently, it is that if I am company A and I have a contract with ArcelorMittal, ArcelorMittal has steel mills everywhere in the world. While today, I didn't care less about where the flat rolled steel came to the beginning of my manufacturing line. Starting from 1st of October, I must know if that is manufactured in Germany, next to my factory, or if that comes from Far East China, which might not be the case, but I must know. That's the extra point. So we are adding an extra complexity in a very competitive, but any business is very competitive, but it is extremely competitive. And that is something that has not been considered to me adequately. Because suppliers might change, the location of the next rolled flat steel might change. And that becomes my problem, which I never had to deal with. So there is an adaptation pattern, which is not just who am I buying from, but also where each of the single unit is coming from. That is the level of complexity that has never been anticipated, never been discussed. The idea, because I've been part of the discussion also since the beginning, was at the border, you make an account of how much steel did you get, and that's it. But it's not exactly like that. It's extremely more complicated than that.
No, this is, you know, again, I'm not sure about Mike and Aaron, but I hadn't thought of it in this angle. It's quite a fascinating angle. Eva, you have your hand up. And I would invite people that are in the audience to raise their little electronic hands so I can see them and give them the floor. But Eva, you go first, please.
Yes, I just want to reflect to one sentence that you said, there is a business to be had. This is the approach of the Commission. Now, customs agents, you can have a new business, how good it is for us. But I just want to make everybody aware that at the current, according to the current legislation, it is either the indirect customs representative or the importer who can become CBAM declarant. And we keep asking the Commission, please open this for a third party who can be a CBAM declarant, who is willing to be a CBAM declarant, and who is an expert in one of the fields. If you imagine a customs agent has at least, I don't know, depending on size, up to 1,000 clients. If out of those 1,000 clients, let's say 200 are importers of CBAM goods from all the fields, that it is completely impossible for the customs agent to become an expert in steel, in ammonium nitrate, in all the in cement. So we are calling for the Commission to allow for a third party who is not a customs agent, but the importers can rely on and use as CBAM declarants. But this is still in progress. We are talking about it, but there is no current confirmation from the Commission that this will be possible.
So I think that we still cannot quit our day jobs yet. We have to wait. Now, I don't see any hands up. Mike, Aaron, anything from your side? Aaron, you go first.
Yeah, really interesting discussion, bringing us down to where the rubber hits the road on this this legislation, which of course we understood was complex, but I think, as Eva said, we don't understand how complex it is in the trenches. A couple of questions for Eva. First, the infamous barbecue. So my understanding was that goods at the level of a manufactured product like a barbecue don't fall under CBAM, but does this fall under other items of steel and iron? Is that does it actually include items like barbecues? Yeah.
Well, I can only convey what I heard yesterday during a meeting with the Commission. This was raised by the EEA, who are importing goods via EEA is the express freight forwarders, DHL, FedEx, UPS. And there is a rule that there is an exemption under 150 euros. And yes, according to the tariff classification, the HS code, this good is actually subject to CBAM. And this was brought up by them. This was brought up by UPS as an example. And we discussed it at length that yes, this is under CBAM regulation, even if it's imported by a private entity. And obviously UPS doesn't want to act as an indirect representative for this private person, because they don't want the responsibility of CBAM reporting. So yes, I can only, as I say, it's not my personal experience, but this was brought up yesterday during the conversation with the Commission.
Very interesting. And then that follows into my second question. So the idea that you would have specialists in third-party handling of CBAM imports, of course, the liability, the way the current regulation is written, the liability for any penalties in incorrect reporting or misreporting would then fall on those third parties, right? So
yes,
not an enviable job.
Yes, but can you imagine, it's not an enviable job when you're a customs representative, because when in the current regulation, it is the customs representative who has this liability without the expertise. So at least
without the expertise,
yeah. So it's not something that we asked for, and as I said, there's very little appetite for it either. I mean, there's not many customs representatives putting their hands up like I did that I want to be a CBAM declarant at this moment. Which is obviously, it's okay for us because we can refuse for EU-based companies, or we cannot take the contracts from non-EU companies, but still then we want a legislation that is executable. So how will it work then if nobody wants to do it? You know, and the SMEs and the smaller companies do not have the expertise themselves in-house. They don't even know what they need to do. So the question comes up. So then, okay, who will report on January 1st?
So are we going to be seeing supply chain disruptions, shortages of basic imported materials?
Can I add something here?
Go ahead, Paolo.
If I may, because I checked the CN code for barbecues is 7321.19.0040. And then I searched into the famous spreadsheet that I quoted, and I cannot find it.
This is not covered. This is not covered.
I cannot find it.
7326 is other items of iron and steel, but 7321 is not covered.
So 7321 is not covered. How can the Commission say that is in? That's, I don't know. I'm asking. It would have been good to have the Commission here.
Well, maybe.
Well, thank you. I already learned something. I will write to the EEA that they don't need to do it. I mean, they don't need to do the reporting for the famous barbecue. But we spent like 30 minutes discussing this one item yesterday. But thanks for letting me know. Actually, I will let them know. Well, I didn't check myself because I would never dream of questioning my colleagues' expertise. But yeah, thank you. That's one item on a very long list ticked. We don't need to worry about the barbecue anymore. Thank you.
We've solved one problem. Now I'm going to worry about my golf clubs. Okay. For Niels, you go first, but then I have two people that have raised their hand and I'd like to give them the floor. But let's first Sabrina after this. And then, but first you go first, Neil.
Yeah, just to go into the question, will there be supply chain disruptions? Because this is a concern. No, I mean, I think Paolo explained very well the administrative and the cost on the side of obtaining this data, but it still assumes that the supplier is willing to provide that data. No? I mean, we know from sanctions that it is super difficult, and that the countries has also sometimes blocking statutes where countries don't provide that kind of data. Then, as I explained, there is often as well confidential competition compliance policies. Yeah, on the European side, we liberalize a little bit which information can be exchanged if that's a green objective, but we also have other countries where sometimes they go into an opposite direction. Hashtag the US now here. So the risk is that the suppliers in the end are not able to obtain the information. Then for quite a while, they will still be able to use default values. At some point, this will not be possible anymore, or will be limited to 20%. And then, yeah, you have a big difficulty, because if you cannot switch your supplier, which in the case of automotive very often is the case because of all the certification requirements. So it takes you up 9 months, easily a year to just go through that process, and that then leaves alone that you also need to get the capacities, etc., etc. So there is a big risk that if we don't work this out in a smart way, how to deal with the fact that maybe some foreign suppliers may not provide the data at all, then we will have supply chain disruptions that cannot be ruled out, definitely.
Well, Sabrina, you go first, and then Peter Bocek. But Sabrina, you are first. Just introduce yourself, because frankly, I don't know. I don't think we met. Sabrina?
Okay, thank you so much for including me in this town hall. My name is Sabrina Shaw, and I am a former colleague of Aaron's. Hello, Aaron. Thank you for your talk. I'm here in Geneva at the Graduate Institute at the Forum on Trade, Environment, and the SDGs. And I'm listening to these practical details and that they count. And I'm wondering, how does this process, these comments, these concerns, how do they trickle up to policy? Number one. How do they feed into discussions at the WTO and the circular economy, supply chain forum, work on micro and small and medium enterprises, decarbonization efforts? And after the COVID supply chain disruptions, which we saw had incredible impacts, especially on Africa and developing countries, LDCs, and looking forward to MC13, as well as COP28 in Davos, how can these practical details trickle up to policy, especially at the international level? Thank you.
Thanks, Sabrina. Peter Bocek?
Thank you. Peter Bocek. I'm with CEFIC, the European Chemical Industry, and we have noticed, of course, that hydrogen and ammonia, together with fertilizers, have been included in the first tranche of the scope. And we have said, well, if you really seriously consider to enlarge the scope to chemicals, you really need to cover the export challenge that was nicely described by Aaron, but you also need to find solutions how to make it practicable. For us, the risk of circumvention is big. That means it is nice to hear that maybe the barbecue is not included, but this, of course, entails the risk that domestic steel will be avoided and that barbecues come in from outside Europe in future, and there is no barbecue construction or making anymore in Europe. So this is really a big concern we have also with chemicals. And we see that this has obviously not been fully thought through, and there is not only a risk of supply disruption, but also a risk of circumvention looming. Thank you.
Very well. Look, I think there were, the question was, first was around these practicalities, which may sound as a barbecue or not a barbecue, but in the end, it is going to be thousands of barbecues or thousands of items that people are going to get confused. They will get eventually sorted out, hopefully, but nevertheless, there will be some chaos at the beginning. And then Peter Bocek, Vicente is not here. I'm not sure he would have been able to quite answer Sabrina's questions. But anybody else wants to pick up maybe Michael, Aaron, do you guys want to pick up on this in some way? Can you imagine how it will trickle, or this is something that should actually become a lesson learned for all the others that are putting these things in place?
Well, briefly, I'll say 2 or 3 thoughts in response to what I was listening to, which was indeed, to echo what Aaron said, very fascinating. There was also, when the EU ETS launched, concern about the capabilities to implement the emissions reporting, but more importantly, the verification, which had to be done by external third parties, so independent third parties. And there was a shortage of that. And it does make me wonder, as Eva was describing, that there's lacking expertise. And this is not a labor market in which people are lining up for new opportunities. It's really hard to get skilled people to fill the ranks of additional people we might need to carry out this stuff. At the same time, I wonder if it's really going to cause supply chain disruptions, because especially then in the definitive phase, it's not like you have to, you can't actually even bring in goods without having the accurate emissions reporting. This is an annual obligation from what I understand. But nonetheless, and this starts to answer a little bit Sabrina's question, everything we're discussing now and all the experiences we make over the next 2.5 years are going to inform the rules for this definitive period. So we don't, for instance, know yet to what extent using default values is going to be permissible. Of course, they may not always be the most favorable ones, given that there will be the markup and it's an average that many producers might outperform. But nonetheless, it may be something that's allowed beyond the 20% that are currently in this interim, implementation regulation, implementing regulation. So everything we're doing now is meant to trickle up to the policy level, at least in the EU. The international dimension, WTO, what you were describing, Sabrina, that's a different question. And as you know, the politics are very difficult, and multilateralism is not, in its best health. So whether and to what extent we manage to also have robust international discussions that reflect and try to deal with some of these challenges, I think is everybody's guess. But nonetheless, it is a learning phase, and I think we should be somewhat optimistic that lessons will be reflected when we get to the actual, when the rubber really hits the road in terms of the payment obligations.
Okay, Niels?
Yeah, maybe to add a little bit on to make it very concrete. No, so I mean, we are still waiting, for instance, for an IT platform. If there would be at some point a platform where foreign suppliers could provide their data, then EU customers could access that. That would, for instance, reduce the burden a little bit, because suppliers have different customers in the EU. At the same time, the customers don't all in themselves need to reach out. Also, it would work more in the direction of templates, etc. And could potentially, if you make the security as well, address a little bit this competition concern, because then the liability for that comes much closer to the commission or to the authority that will be hosting this facility. That, of course, then also needs to be accompanied by outreach globally, and that is partly happening. I know the EU and the US are talking about methodologies how to measure carbon, and then have the problem that they have very different ideas on how to tackle this problem. So we need to be a little bit realistic where we can be, but probably the way is to have a very concrete project and to work on that. And that could be as simple as an IT platform, and try to work around it as much as possible. That would be one idea, of where things where it trickles down to policy or implementation more even than policy.
Eva?
Yes, I just wanted to confirm that the third country access to CBAM recording is already on the table. We were discussing this as well, along with the third-party reporting as well. There is a call from our industry, as well as some of our members who are producers, that registry and not just registry, reporting directly on CBAM goods should be available for third country producers, because there is confidentiality data which they don't want to share, and this is already being discussed. I just wanted to say this, that is already on the table. We don't know what the results will be, but we have talked about this as well yesterday.
Very good. Well, at least I'm happy that these discussions are taking place. I think I'd like to move on, and we can continue, because the discussion is obviously not in silos. But the second part is on regulation and trade partner countries, and really looking at what do you see, or what are you contemplating? I'm sure maybe not all of you are getting questions. Maybe your staff or many of you are involved in policy, so there's not direct questions coming to you. But what is happening in your countries? And for that, it's good to see you, Bahar. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to see you in Ankara, and pleasure that you appreciated joining us today. Jong Lee from KITA, the Korean International Trade Association, based here in Brussels. Last but not least, it's a real pleasure. I missed you in Delhi, Rajani, but it's a pleasure to see you. I hope to see you in COP, Mr. Rajani Rashmi from TERI, the Energy Resources Institute in New Delhi, probably the most well-known think tank in India, and certainly a former senior member of the bureaucracy in India, and I think lead of the negotiating team for the Indian delegation in the COPs. So I will start with Bahar. You make quite a very passionate and a very passionate and interesting intervention in Ankara. So I'm watching with interest to see what is your reaction. I'm sure that you will also react to some of the things that you heard before.
Okay, thank you very much, Andre. It's good to see you, and I thank you also for the invitation. It was a very interesting discussion, also to hear from the European Union perspective. Actually, I would prefer to share a presentation if it's okay, but you would have to just allow me.
I am allowing you. I have already done.
Okay, thank you so much. Then on my presentation, as you have just mentioned, I would like to give a brief overview of the work that is being carried out by Turkey in response to the European Union CBAM. And of course, I should underline that Turkey and European Union has a customs union. So this means that actually the free movement of goods apply between Turkey and EU. And of course, we should see that the CBAM would constitute a significant challenge to our customs union relationship and the free movement of goods. And here you can see that our total exports for CBAM products is about $13 billion. It was about $13 billion in 2022. And also looking from the perspective of the European Union, actually, we are among the biggest supplier of the European Union. And this is especially the case for iron and steel products, and also aluminum products, which account almost for $12 billion of our exportation in 2022. And here, of course, considering that significant impact, not only of the CBAM, but in general, the European Green Deal on our relationship, to complement our climate efforts as the Ministry of Trade, we have prepared a Green Deal action plan in order to support Turkey's alignment to European Union policies. And actually, one of the 9 main headings of the action plan constitutes the carbon border adjustment. And here, looking to the actions that are being carried out by Turkey in relation to carbon border adjustments, I think I can group them under 4 main pillars, though there are several other actions that I believe that would support Turkey's green transition, and then hence would be helpful also in mitigating the impact of the EU CBAM. But of course, for Turkey, we have initiated roadmap studies, strategic roadmaps for low carbon production of energy-intensive sectors. We have started from CBAM sectors because they have a priority, and this includes steel, aluminium, cement, and one for fertilizers as well. We are about to complete the first 3 ones that I mentioned, and to announce them. Actually, these roadmaps are analyzing the available technologies, the technology gaps in Turkey, the investment needs, and several other issues that are related to the green transition of these sectors. And one of the aims is to put into place the necessary support mechanism for encouraging these industries also to decarbonize. Another important tool in that process would, of course, be to implement a carbon pricing mechanism in Turkey. This is an issue, actually, that has been under work for several years, I would say. We already have an MRV system, so monitoring, reporting, and verification system, which is completely fully aligned with the European Union. So we are already monitoring the greenhouse emissions of those installations that should normally be covered by the EU ETS system. Now it is, of course, important to complement this with a carbon pricing mechanism. The work for initiating the pilot system is underway, and we are expecting the system to be in place, the pilot phase to be in place by the end of next year. And of course, we deem that mechanism important, especially for also collecting the necessary income to support the green investment, also of the energy investment, but also the transformation of the industries. In that process, as it is the case in the European Union, I think innovation is very important. And our scientific institution has been preparing green technology roadmaps. And among them, there are also these sectors which would be included under CBAM. Of course, the aim is also to increase the incentives to R&D, especially. Another important pillar of that work is actually to align our system completely with the European Union one methodologically first. I think in terms of pricing, it would not be fair to expect that Turkey can start from the same level from day one, but we also have an aim to catch up the European Union in that process. And of course, for Turkey, another important challenge, because we have the free movement of goods currently for the goods that are placed in the market, we recognize the conformity assessment procedures. So that means that the goods do not require double testing or double verification. But actually, the CBAM would also challenge that principle for all these goods that would be covered. And the fourth pillar of all our efforts is also to ensure the compliance of the CBAM with our bilateral arrangements, which is not easy. I think we have already heard about the challenges in the first session, but I would like also to mention some of them. I think that would also contribute to the discussions. In that process, I think our position, we understand the EU's efforts to implement this carbon border adjustment. But here we believe that, of course, we should be establishing a level playing field for all, for European Union operators and also for exporters. And here we see that actually the balance has been skewed towards EU operators, and the requirements that has been just introduced under CBAM actually disadvantages the exporters. And it is for us very important to contribute actively to the European Union processes through, the official meetings, but also by providing our feedbacks in European Union consultation mechanisms. I think these are all the work that we are conducting in the long-term perspective, but of course in the short-term perspective, I think enabling the adaptation of the exporters is quite important. As the Ministry of Trade, we are holding training sessions to exporters, but also training of trainers for the union chambers, which we are expecting to establish help desks after the new year. But of course, we are also facing several challenges, because just take the spreadsheet that was mentioned in the first session. It was just updated a couple of weeks ago. We are still expecting the announcement of the benchmarks. Michael has just mentioned about it, whether the benchmarks would be useful or not. But here I can say that actually in the production line and in the value chain in general, the emissions are concentrated in the lower and first phases. And actually this means that if you are, for example, producing an aluminium product and buying, for example, the primary aluminium and importing it, and this is the case for Turkey and Turkish exporters, Actually, this is the primary aluminum that contains the emissions, and the embedded emissions in product is higher, more intensive there. And actually, this means that the probability to use that 20% threshold is very, very low. Because if you are producing fasteners and bolts, then again, it's the steel that you are buying that would have the embedded emissions intensively, not your own production processes. And especially for the SMEs that are placed by the end of the process, this process causes several difficulties. As just Andre said, we are like holding trainings, also publishing, preparing several sectoral guidelines, but we see that never is enough. The process is new, very complicated, and especially for SMEs, there are still several challenges to be met. Just to contribute very quickly to some important elements and the differences that I mentioned about the CBAM implementation between the importers and the European Union producers. I think there are much more. We have already also provided our feedback in the EU consultation process for those that are interested, but I would just concentrate on some of them for the sake of time. Actually, the scope of the European Union ETS and CBAM is very, very different. Just let me give you an example. The EU ETS applies to just facilities that are above a threshold, but CBAM applies to products. So what that means, for example, for the case of Turkey, we have less than 10 establishments for aluminium production that normally should be included under ETS and that are included in our MRV system. But guess how many exporters we have? More than 100. And all the others are actually very small producers, which now would have to comply with these CBAM requirements and would face these technical barriers to trade. And actually, we believe that there is a way to handle with that. For those small operators, actually, the emissions are on the production phase of these big installations. And it's just a simple accounting system where they can just prove and use the reporting of these installations from where they are actually getting the primary aluminum, for example. And this would actually enable also to still account for the carbon price, but also to take the hurdles. There is another important issue where, as you very well know, due to the over allocations of free allowances, the European Union I would not say importers, but the users in the European Union or the producers, whenever they are, if they are high-performing installations, they have the possibility to sell these allowances. But this would not be, again, possible for the importers. And here, again, we think that for the importers, it can be possible to have, to determine credits that can be then allocated to their future importation. And finally, I think CBAM, the use of CBAM revenues is also an issue that should be taken into account within the context of overall climate discussions in the world. We believe that the CBAM revenues, as it is the case under the EU ETS, and it is used for the green transformation, should not be used actually to subsidize the green transformation of the European Union itself, but instead should be allocated to green projects in those exporting third countries. And we believe it is, as I mentioned, important for the climate goals. Now, I would not mention other details, but there are, as I mentioned, a lot within the legislation. We still need clarity on the accounting of the carbon prices in third countries. This has already been mentioned. Now, the use of renewable energy for scope 2 emissions actually is very Eurocentric, I would say, and it gives only the possibility to account for your renewable investments if you are a manufacturer, if you are an auto producer. But if you have a separate investment, which is the case for almost all manufacturers in Turkey, even though you are using renewable energy, the current legislation doesn't allow them to account for their renewable energy investments. There are different benchmarkings for the electric arc furnaces and blast furnaces for steel products, which are the same, but receive different benchmarks. And I think it's very questionable in the context of climate goals. And finally, we are also receiving concerns about the declaration of trade secrets. You have seen the Excel spreadsheets, which requires you to declare every details of your suppliers, as well as your relationship with the third country suppliers. This was already mentioned. And actually, we believe that these kind of data should not be declared to the European Union importers, but instead to a common database governed by the European Commission, and which would allow the European Union importers to only access the relevant information. I think these are generally my feedbacks on both questions, and I thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Bahar. I think there will be a lot of questions. I will now go to Jong Lee from Kita. I'm sure that Korean companies are asking quite a few questions. There's intense trade between Korea and the EU. So what do you hear?
Well, good morning. Good afternoon. I'm Jong-ah Lee from Korea International Trade Association. Sorry, I'm in Korea right now. It's 11 p.m. So
okay.
Good morning or good afternoon. Sorry. I would like to briefly share the implications for Korean industry concerning exports and the challenges encountered by Korean government and industries and their corresponding responses. It is expected that steel industry will encounter the most significant impact in Korea, followed by aluminum industry. And specifically, steel exports amounted to $4.5 billion, constituting approximately 89.3% of CBAM products exports to the EU, and aluminum reached $500 million, making up about 10.6%. And in Korea, for example, for the fertilizers and cement and hydrogen, the proportion of these three exports is only about 0.1% of the total exports of CBAM goods. And for the electricity, the South Korea's power grid is geopolitically isolated, so it's not impossible to be exported. So in South Korea, it appears that apart from steel and aluminum, the impact from the CBAM will be minimal. However, it is important to be noted that European Commission is considering to expand the scope of CBAM to include organic chemicals and plastics. So these two sectors collectively accounted for approximately $7 billion last year. And that takes about like 10% of the total export to EU. So when these are included in the future, it is predictable that burden on Korean industry will increase even further. From when CBAM was first proposed, Korean companies have faced challenges since this is the brand new mechanism that has never been implemented before. As only some implementing acts have been provided so far, companies still lack understanding, and they are facing lots of difficulties in preparing for the upcoming reporting obligations. It seems that large enterprises have been relatively well prepared. However, small and medium-sized enterprises are still struggling as they lack knowledge and lack of capacity for unorganized MRV systems. So they do have a significant burden when it comes to submit information that EU is requesting, including the data relating carbon emissions. So how the South Korean government is supporting and how are we responding? The South Korean government estimates that roughly 140 domestic companies will be affected by CBAM. And Korean government is working diligently and both domestically and internationally to mitigate the impact on the Korean industry. So they have been organizing task forces with major steel companies and associated industry groups to deliberate on the challenges and formulate response strategies. And they also have engaged in several meetings with EU to discuss the current situation and convey the problems and the opinions of the companies. And as far as I know, Korean government is also heading meeting with EU taxation and customs this month, and they are organizing this meeting table with Korean industry with EU taxation department. Also, Korean government has held several information sessions and established 2 help desks to assist companies with having problem with preparing reporting obligations. One is for general inquiries and related key concepts, and the other one is mainly assisting technical assistance, such as calculating carbon emissions and submitting report and utilizing EU communication templates. Furthermore, current government has published the guidelines and provides detailed information on CBAM, and the guideline takes about like 560 pages, and it covers like from the background to the general concept and like all detailed information, how CBAM is being implemented, and importantly, they also provide Korean language translated version of both CBAM regulation and implementing regulations. So companies can actually see the guidelines and prepare for the reporting obligations. And Korean government has also committed to continuously support companies by providing and distributing manuals and casebooks on emission calculations for each industry sector subject to CBAM by providing trainings and consultations and more briefing sections if it's needed. And according to the news, they are also planning to allocate 13 billion won, which is about 99 million next year, to promote development of low carbon technologies and equipment replacement. And they will focus on R&D to strengthen the competitiveness of industries with high greenhouse gas emissions. Not only the current government, but also KITA is supporting Korean companies. KITA is one of the largest business organizations in Korea with over 73,000 member companies. Within KITA, there is a Center for Trade Studies and Cooperation where we respond to trade-related issues by conducting research, providing consultations, and proposing policy recommendations to the government. Since 2021, we have published several trade reports regarding CBAM. And just last month, we had a briefing session focusing on the transitional period, providing information on what and how should companies to prepare and what they need to be aware of during the transitional period. We are also operating the EU Trade Response Center to provide further assistance to companies in need of help related to EU trade regulations and measures. And recently, we had lots of interest regarding on the CBAM, and mostly they were asking whether their company is covered by CBAM and like how they should calculate carbon emissions and how to prepare, how to use that templates, and what's the carbon price, like what's the difference between EU ETS and Korean ETS? Are we like, can we get adjustment from price paid in Korea and so on? Nevertheless, we are assisting, and nevertheless, we are trying to help Korean industry. While global economy is in unstable situation due to the various factors, and because not all the implementing regulations have been released, it is the fact that implementation of CBAM right now gives more burdensome and uncertainty to the companies and the governments. We whenever companies ask, how should we figure out what's the default value? For example, like last month, we had no idea because there was no regulations were published and released. So several concerns also have been raised regarding the potential challenges that CBAM can bring, including the burden on steel supply and demand, price increases, and changes in the global steel trade structure, and so on. And also, there was a question raised about whether the EU is adequately prepared for the implementation of CBAM and whether there will be equitable handling of certification and the distribution of revenue among the member states after year 2026 when it comes to definitive period. Well, this is all I have for today. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
If that is all, then I think we're safe, John. It's a heck of a long list, and I didn't expect any less from the Republic of Korea, but be prepared by that way. So we're certainly not disappointed. It'd be interesting to hear if some of the stuff that Eva was mentioning, whether your exporters are running into that as a problem or not, or maybe that thing hasn't come up to your attention yet. But obviously, she's raising something which seems horribly practical that I don't think anybody thought about. Rajani, good to see you. Thank you very much for patience. We were in Delhi. Indians were always vocal and interested in how things were progressing in CBAM. And while Terry is not going to be in the business of filling out forms, nevertheless, you have your ear to the ground as to how the government and business is viewing this and preparing themselves. Please.
Thank you very much, Andre. I hope I'm audible to you.
Very much so.
Okay. Thank you very much. And it's wonderful. It was fascinating listening to enriching discussion here. And thanks for letting me a part of this discussion. And thanks for your generous introduction, which I may not deserve actually fully. I'm certainly I'm part of the think tank now, so I can only give you a feedback on how things are being viewed from a broad, very broad perspective. I don't have any specific information on how the industry is going to react, but the impression that I get is that that industry doesn't. It's definitely very uncomfortable about the additional administrative burden that it is going to cast on them. So they have a lot of there are anticipations, anxiety, and reservations about it. But I think nonetheless they will still prepare for it. For the first time, while they have been trying to do something at the project level, now they'll be exposed at the sectoral level. So that's their main concern. Government is, I think, the Ministry of Commerce is actively engaged with them in trying to assuage their concerns. And as you may be knowing that the EU and India are engaged in a discussion on free trade agreement. EU is the third, in fact, the second largest partner in terms of a group of countries. ASEAN is the first one, EU is the second, followed by, of course, the US and China. But if for European Union, India is the 10th largest trading partner. So it's an important trading relationship between the two countries, between the two entities, and it's important to preserve that relationship. So I'm sure the space offered by the EU-India Free Trade Agreement, which is under discussion between European Union and India, will offer that space for resolution of some of these concerns. Now, I'll come to that a little later. But the first issue, I think, which government has still not let it go completely, is that of raising a dispute. Because after all, they are coming from a point of principle. Although we have crossed that stage, as far as European Union is concerned, I think they have already crossed that stage. They have gone to the stage of implementing a border adjustment measure, which is not fully consistent with environmental obligations. But nonetheless, it's still good to understand the broad background from which the government of India and the industry in India might approach this, is that it is seen as a protectionist and seen as discriminatory, because trade is certainly not the most optimal way of resolving these kind of issues, because in the carbon decarbonization measures in India are a little complex. They are not seen only from the point of view of decarbonization. They are seen more from the point of view of transition. And that transition needs a lot of finance and technology. So it would have been perhaps better to deal with these issues in an investment framework or a technology framework rather than a purely decarbonization framework. But nonetheless, I think we can still find a common ground there in the discussions on the free trade agreement. And there are, it will be good if the developments in India, the recent developments are taken into account there. I'll just give you 3 or 4 pieces of information on that. The first is that they have amended their Energy Conservation Act to mandate renewable energy obligation for the major industrial units, which are already covered by energy efficiency mandates. So now there is a specific mandate to go for renewable energy production and consumption. That is a major obligation, in addition to what they were already doing for the purpose of energy efficiency gains. All of them can be converted into carbon denominated units. The second one is that they have gone for a carbon market now, a formal carbon market within India, which didn't exist earlier. Now, this market will begin with trading of units, carbon denominated units, because there is still no specific carbon obligation on the industries. There is a specific energy consumption and production obligation. So that will be converted into CO2 terms and that will be traded. So now they have gone in for evolving a domestic carbon market. And in future, I think from next 2 or 3 years down the line, they will perhaps come up with a specific emissions intensity target for the industries, which will then become the basis for trading these carbon denominated units. So, and then third is that, we have started, the government has started looking at the way in which they can regulate or perhaps standardize the voluntary carbon market, which is some kind of influence or bring to bear some kind of influence on that. So these things are happening together, and it will be good for the European Commission and the Union to recognize this. I fully agree with Aaron when he said that one of the possible ways of addressing this is looking at the domestic offsets. Whatever the domestic market is doing, if that is recognized by the trading partners, that will help to a large extent allay the concerns of the industry. The third point, which I'm sorry I missed it, the first in terms of regulation is that the disclosure norms for the major corporates, and the disclosure norms are still not in form of emissions, but they're now going to report to the European Union, the European Commission. So disclosure of their emissions information to a third party without disclosing it to the government or a mandated entity within the country, that's a little problematic here. So I think in a matter of constructive finding a constructive solution to the problem, it will be good if we can recognize all these developments within the domestic market and establish a methodology by which this can be offset against the obligations. I'll end here. The last point which I would like to make is that I think apart from finding a bilateral solution to the through a common space in the free trade agreement or otherwise, we should also look at multilateral solutions here. After all, we found a solution to the aviation tax. We found a solution in terms of CORSIA. There is still an opportunity available while we are preparing for the final stage of CBAM. Within that preparatory phase, we should look at other multilateral solutions where we can recognize the carbon decarbonization measures or investments in renewable energy or other measures at sectoral level or even at economy-wide level through the NDCs and under Article 6 and Article 4 negotiations under the Paris Agreement. I'll stop here and thank you very much, Andre, once again.
Well, thank you, Rajani. Look, I think this was a detailed list in some cases of what governments have started to do. We've heard from the other side, meaning the those that act in the EU, and some of the practical things that are facing in terms of importing, and whether these things are already percolating into Republic of Korea or Turkey. Sooner or later, they will come up. Whether they will be solvable through practicalities or a change of policy is something that needs to be done. Also, Rajani has spoken about some of the very important issues that still need to be addressed in many ways. Michael and Aaron, I want to invite you whether there was something that you wanted at this point before I open it to the rest of the audience.
Well, I'm happy to very quickly maybe react. I think what was interesting here, despite there being some wistfulness that we didn't end up solving this problem at a multilateral level and with a more first best solution, as we all know, that could have been, they say, broad agreement on a global carbon price, for instance, that we've ended up in this, but it's no longer, and this is consistent with previous town halls, it's no longer a position of pure opposition. It's very much thinking about how do we now help our domestic companies adapt to and ultimately comply with the CBAM, and how can we adopt policies that both assist them and lower the burden from having to comply with the CBAM, namely domestic carbon pricing and domestic MRV systems. And I think that's very, very welcome on the one hand. I think it shows that the debate overall has matured significantly from 5 to 10 years ago when BCAs were already border carbon adjustments discussed, and it tended to be quite a different debate. And it also, to me, suggests that we've entered a new phase of international, views in major emerging upper middle or middle income economies regarding their role in climate policy. So it is sort of a reflection of how the world has changed since the Paris Agreement was adopted almost 10 years ago. That to me is encouraging and heartening, but it doesn't, of course, gloss over the fact that there are, and you all described it, a lot of challenges domestically to make sure that companies, especially smaller companies that have never had to deal with this kind of thing, have the means at hand to do so. And the CBAM certainly precipitates, I think, a lot of this earlier than they may have otherwise expected or been required to do so. So it is incumbent, as Aaron said in his initial remarks, very much incumbent also in Europe and other advanced economies to provide assistance and make sure that this process is smooth and cooperative and forward-looking, and not something that's confrontational and full of frictions. And I hope that we are on track on that, but I'm sure there's a lot of work to be done.
Aaron, from your side, any things that it's quite, people are preparing and reacting in very active way, if you want, to some very practical things. There are practical things, there are policy things that need to be ironed out. So there's work on both ends of the spectrum. Anything from your side that you pick up at this stage?
Well, I agree with you. So we're looking at challenges here, which we have transitional challenges. How do you get the ability for third-party entities to be authorized declarants? How do they manage their liability? There's lack of information on default values. There's problems finding the services of accredited verifiers. There's going to be a shifting of preferred suppliers to those that are able and willing to give the kind of information the EU wants. These are the transitional challenges as we move into the compliance with this new regime. But then we've heard about other more fundamental challenges, right? So the differential burden between what producers under the ETS have to bear and what exporters down to the SME level have to bear. A relatively higher burden on SME exporters overall through the regulation. Severe disadvantages for downstream producers within the EU and the risk of leakage for those producers as we mess around with the scope of coverage. Both of these types of challenges are extremely important. I'm not selling short the transitional challenges. When I call them transitional challenges, they're material. But I think in the long run, the latter, the more fundamental challenges are going to be harder to fix. Anyway, rich conversation, very enlightening up to this point. I'm looking forward to the discussion now.
Bahar, anything from your side? I mean, look, it was quite an impressive meeting in Ankara. Our friends from TEBAV have put together quite a wonderful gathering of people. Anything that you take from this discussion so far? Because you are acting at a policy level, and you're entering into dialogue with the EU and EU policymakers. However, we also hear this very practical thing: is any of this stuff percolating in any way, any more practical stuff? Because you may end up start having, if these people cannot find somebody to report for them, you may end up having people being penalized or not, or real shifts in trade patterns, and people avoiding certain jurisdiction if that's necessary. Would that kind of also lead to trade patterns, or people prefer to do business intra-EU because there's less hassle?
Okay, I think, Andre, what Iron has just mentioned was reflecting our current situation, maybe in general. Now we are in a phase where we are facing the transitional challenges, and everyone has been, I think, concentrated, as we have also listened from the panelists. Each and every country, including the European Union and also member states, we are now making our preparations in order to help importers and exporters. But of course, the system is also quite complicated. So this is also the reason of the difficulties. Just give me also an example. It's not about enabling our SMEs to report. Actually, they are also importing from third countries. So we are mentioning about a value chain. So this is to level up the ability of all the supply chain to comply with these rules, actually. And I think once we would overcome these transitional challenges, it is far more important, I think, to concentrate especially on the definitive periods. Because, as I mentioned, our aim should be to really achieve a level playing field for all. I also hear the concerns of the European Union operators, which I think are very valid. But I also hear the concerns of our operators, of other third country operators, which are also valid, and they constitute actually challenges to the multilateral, but also our bilateral trade arrangements. We should also be aware about that. And here, I think the best thing is also to aim to have a truly climate policy tool. This should be what should guide all our efforts. And I think in that process, from the beginning, we aimed to contribute to that process actively. And as I mentioned, we are not only communicating the challenges or the problems to the European Union, but we are even trying to help design the solutions. As I just mentioned, I'm sorry I didn't have much time to mention all of them, but our aim is to actively contribute to that process, to turn CBAM to a truly climate policy tool. And here we are also collaborating with the European Union, and I'm very hopeful that we would achieve that goal by the end of the transitional period.
Well, thank you. Saul, very quick intervention from your side, because we're beginning to reach toward the end. Any short intervention?
Thank you, Andre. I just really wanted to ask, because obviously Bahar has mentioned that Turkey has their competent authority set up and they're doing everything that they can to help. But we have noticed that there are still 7 countries that need to appoint their national competent authorities. And I wondered if anybody knows what's going on with them. I mean, we're particularly waiting for Spain to appoint theirs. And going then on from that, because once you've got the approval from the NCA, that will then allow you access to the CBAM transitional registry. Just wondered if anybody knows when the test registry will be available so that we can all, try and get it to work, so that when we have to report in January, that we're not all going to be making massive mistakes. So those are the two questions, and thank you.
Well, I think that the latter question is probably something that Vicente may have or may not have been able to react to. I think the other one, Bahar, I think your name was mentioned.
Actually, the question was linked to the member states' authorities. I guess we are also closely following. This is what I can say. We are informing because our exporters, and as you have rightly pointed out, there are still 7 member states that needs to determine their national competent authorities. But as I mentioned, we still need to have the benchmarks to be also published before the end of this year. And I think still the producers would have very little time in order to complete the requirements. What I can say for Turkey, we still encourage all our exporters to report as much as, on the true calculations, not using the benchmarks, because we think that this is also what would be the healthy solution, but only in cases where they have real difficulties, like if they cannot receive the information from the importer, or in such cases that they consider the use of these benchmarks. But I think we should all recognize that the time frame is also very limited, and especially for those installations in Turkey. Also, we have more than 700 installations under the MRV. So for them, they are already used to these kind of reporting. But for other SMEs, I think it's in general international standards like ISO 14064 or 67 that they were using. And this is a very different methodology there. In some places, the legislation only recognizes, possibilities for reporting in terms of, I think it was the case also for the use of some renewable energy, only certification provided, of the European Union. So there are still a lot of things to work on. But what I can say, I think we are trying to contribute to this process as much as possible. And for these sectors, we already have the guidelines of the European Union, but we are now preparing sectoral guidelines to help all the sectors, to fill the spreadsheets and how they should fill, these the spreadsheet, and taking into account which processes specific to these sectors. But I think your question would also be relevant, especially on the part of these custom procedures, where we may face difficulty, and it would not be dependent on the preparation of the exporters, but it's rather the member states.
Thank you very much.
Rajani, thank you very much, Bahar. Rajani?
Thank you, Andre. I just wanted to respond briefly to Mr. Mailing's point about, the multilateral solutions being a failure, and we should make some progress on the global carbon tax. I would suggest that it's fine. I mean, the carbon taxes are not an anathema now, which they were about 10 years ago. But to think of a global measure is still a little too far ahead in time, because we are not at the same standards, the same level of development, same level of industrialization. So the best way is under Article 6 or under Article 4 of the Paris Agreement to recognize the national measures and give them a global recognition. Global, no doubt, but a national measure which can be recognized based on agreed methodologies, agreed standards. And one of the possible solutions to my mind is, all this talk about the increased administrative burden, transaction cost, confidentiality of data, and all those problems. Verification of the reductions. So one of the possible ways, and then to echo what Aaron had said, that if European Union doesn't look at this as a revenue raising measure, why doesn't it transfer this power to tax the exports to the exporting countries? Rather than taxing at the European border, let them tax it at the export borders and collect that revenue. That will avoid a lot of administrative problems which you are all talking about. The appointing third parties for verification for all kinds of things. Let this be taxed by the exporting country and collect that revenue, and then in turn that revenue can be used for upgrading those industries and helping them move towards decarbonization. Thank you.
Yes, we have seen that, Rani. We've seen that in the when we landed actually in Delhi. There was a report that I think in the Hindustan Times there would be discussions between the EU and the Indian government on this topic. Michael, you're full of surprises today. So interesting to hear your views on global taxes. But we couldn't resist that, could we? Now. Any last? I also would like to ask the previous panelists if they're still on. I think some of them may be, or some of them may have moved on. But if there were anything that they take away from this discussion, because we are reaching towards the end of the conversation. Look, this is Paolo. Anything that you take? I mean, you heard other governments, and Niels, you heard other governments talk about their preparation. Some very, very, very detailed. Interesting, Mr. Rashni bringing up a number of if you want more policy concerns. But what do you guys take from this? I mean, is this matching between what you expect from other countries, or how do you see this?
From what I see, if I can comment, there is a wider understanding that carbon pricing is a good way to go if we want all together work toward a decarbonization of our economies, so that we can take advantage of the marginal improvements that can be done in each geography. And that, to me, makes and square the circle with what we have been discussing and understanding that the situation of one geography only leading on ETS and CBAM is gonna be more of a disturbance than a solution to the issue. So in a sense, to me, what Europe is doing is extremely valuable if that is a seed that is planted on fertile grounds. And when I hear representatives that have been speaking in this second part, I understand that there is fertile ground on which CBAM can develop, CBAM and ETS, because they are two sides of the same coin, can develop. So I bring with me a positive feeling, notwithstanding all the difficulties that I shared in my first part of the discussion. Thank you.
Paolo, thank you very much. I very appreciated intervention. Niels?
Yeah, no, I think it was very interesting to hear the extent to which the third countries are already working as well in making industry ready. No, and I think that is really a key takeaway for me for this day. I mean, in the end, suppliers there are many, so it is really important that there is someone who's also reaching out to them, and that there is some advantage to it as well. No, I think that was very clearly the message coming from third countries. I wouldn't say that we don't need to invest as well in greening European industry, but for instance, it's very clear that the hydrogen mostly will be produced outside of Europe. So this is a way where you could help also maybe the steel and aluminium industries in India or in South Korea. No, I mean, working in partnerships, making sure that some of this CBAM money will be made available for these kind of projects, that could probably be a very good way to go. And I think then we really have a win-win situation, and that may also help then further increase the acceptance also of all those other suppliers that now have all kinds of requests coming from the European market, whereas they may have bigger markets now. I mean, we are a big market, but not necessarily always the biggest for everyone. So I think we need to be very careful to that as well, that we don't just preach, but also cooperate and our investment partners.
Well, look, interesting. I think this is a saga that is not okay. While we're writing the saga and we're learning how to deal with it, it's obviously not something that this is the end of the road. This will continue to develop from a policy, but in the long term, this is going to be a policy debate that will continue. But meanwhile, in the short term, we have to survive. And having to survive means having supply chains that are not being interrupted or troubled, and also learning how to deal with the new business models. I mean, Paulo, very interesting. You know, if now I'm an importer, I'm going to ask for the full price. CBAM, VAT included, CBAM included, everything included. Until now, there was no CBAM charge. Now, all of a sudden, I'm going to have to ask, what is your price? Is that include CBAM or not? I'm not sure that people have done that before. That is going to start then putting pressure, indeed, some pressure on different producers, maybe to do different things or things in a different way. Before I close, I want to ask my colleagues, Aaron, any last words from, not last word in this session on this topic?
I can jump in. I'm sure Michael has probably more thoughtful comments, but like many of the other presenters, I was impressed by the amount of reaction in some of the affected countries to what's going on in the European Union, and it extends beyond what we've heard here. Michael and Andre and I have all been impressed by the impressed in an objective sense by the amount of work on, for example, carbon pricing in countries affected by CBAM. In response to CBAM, and the idea of the Turkish roadmaps, technology decarbonization roadmaps for the sectoral coverage is another example of the same sort of reaction. None of this, I think, grew out of nowhere. All of it built on existing objectives in the affected countries, but perhaps it was accelerated by the CBAM. And I think those effects are magnified by the realization that CBAM is not an isolated requirement. It's part of a green wave of trade measures put in place by governments that consider carbon as an important element in traded goods. You have the EU deforestation-free products regulation. You have the corporate sustainability due diligence requirements, green procurement in the US, clean fuel standards around the world, private sector demands going up the value chain. It is going to be a different world in the future. And if I want to abstract from the level of challenges, we have our transitional challenges, our fundamental challenges with the CBAM. This is an international town hall. We also need to think about the more systemic challenges of global coordination of these requirements, such that we can manage that they achieve the end of environmental improvement, of dealing with the climate crisis and other environmental crises, at the same time as they don't screw up the trade flows that are the lifeblood of our global economy, that are the engine of development and poverty alleviation, right? That kind of coordination, that kind of trade facilitation won't happen if all of these efforts happen just happenstance. If there's no concerted effort to coordinate them, find best principles, best practice in a way that makes them work together seamlessly. So that's our even larger global challenge.
Any challenges for you, Michael?
Well said, Aaron. I think that was like the broad and cross-cutting answer, or a lot of what I was going to say as well. I'll try and phrase it in this way. Glass half full to me is, we're seeing how the complexities and challenges notwithstanding, there's preparations ongoing, and I think we'll manage to deal with all this. It reflects or reminds me very much of when the EU ETS was started, and in the beginning, everybody was bewildered. How do we deal with this? How do we comply with it? And everybody worked their way through, and I think we're seeing that. That's sort of what Aaron was describing as impressive. There's policy developments, there's technical assistance and support for companies and so on. this is moving in the right direction. At the same time, I also, like Aaron, I think, want to remind us that, 20 years we've worked on carbon pricing, and we've done it rather deliberately. Now in the next 10 years, the scale of the challenge, the speed at which we're looking to transform economies is going to be very different. And with that, also the impacts and the scale of complying with things like CBAM. There's not only the use CBAM, that's the next point. We have a growing number of countries that are starting to turn to border carbon adjustments. And these will look different unless we make a very real effort to coordinate and try to avoid a vast patchwork of different approaches. Some countries, despite what we're seeing on the spread of carbon pricing, will very likely not embrace carbon pricing. I live in one, the United States. So there is definitely going to be a lot still that has to be dealt with much shorter timelines. And the challenge remains daunting. That's the glass half empty, I would say. But all in all, I still take away from this that we're working hard and we're working together, and that's encouraging.
Well, I see the half full, but I also have the glass empty, half empty, because we are heading into turbulent times. And it is, unless we manage it correctly, I think there is a risk. There's no doubt that there is a risk, and we have to be careful, because it doesn't take much to throw this whole trading system into a spin. We've seen it before. We've seen when things change rapidly, sometimes people will react in very strange ways. So while this is obviously something that's going to happen, I think that we're going to have to be very careful and monitor what happens in the next 2 years for two reasons: to make sure that the machine will continue to operate in a good way. And the second thing is that we understand the lessons that are being learned from what we've done during the transition period. In the end, the transition period is for getting people to get used, but also for those that have put the machine in place to also learn lessons and improve the machine. So, and that is not a minor part. This is not like a minor part of the equation. It's quite an important part, because there are many implementing acts that do, and there's a review coming in that will depend on the lessons learned during this transition period. The other part that I would say is also that we have Turkey and Korea here, and India, but there's a lot of these are three countries. There's a lot of other countries. And I don't know if everybody is at the speed of preparation. I mean, I would expect some are, but probably some of them. For instance, I have no idea to the degree in the US people are prepared, or in Mexico. It would be very interesting to hear these things as we move through this other set of projects that we have, and understand how people are prepared. Now, I suspect I will see some of you, many of you, none of you, but I think some of you at the COP. And want to thank everybody that has taken the time. Some people have stayed very late in Korea. It is late. We are used working with people at GGGI, and we know that they are very used to stay late. Bahar, I know you're very busy. Rajani, I think that you also are busy and running around, and also a lot of things on your plate, at both in the upcoming negotiation, but also as Terry, also as our colleagues in the associations. I hope that, we have profited from what you've told us, and I hope that you profited for this discussion, and we hope to see you all again. Again, thank you all very much, and thanks to the audience that have participated in this discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Cheers.
bye.
Bye-bye.